Tesla just announced it is shutting down one of its largest manufacturing facilities in California. Not because demand is falling. Not because the cars are failing. Not because the technology is flawed. But because the state's rules, incentives, and cost structure have made it impossible to operate profitably at the scale Tesla needs. This is happening right now, and it affects far more than one factory. I'm Sophia Miller. On this channel, we follow money, timelines, and consequences. We do not chase headlines. We trace the chain reaction mainstream coverage misses. If you want the full picture, subscribe. This is not about politics. This is about math, incentives, and reality. A policy package designed to improve safety, labor standards, and environmental outcomes has, in practice, raised the cost of manufacturing to a level that forces even the largest companies to reconsider staying. The unintended outcome is not just a factory closure. It is a shift in where American manufacturing happens, and the scale is statewide, then national. In this video, I will break it down step by step, in strict chronological order, showing how each decision led to the next. First, we will look at the timeline of policy changes. Then we will explain how the auto industry actually works. Then we will connect the dots from incentives to action. And finally, we will show the human and economic consequences that follow far beyond the factory gates. 2015, California began tightening emissions rules for industrial facilities. The intended goal was to reduce statewide pollution and meet climate targets. What actually happened was a wave of new compliance requirements for large factories, including monitoring, reporting, and expensive upgrades. For automakers, these costs do not come as a one-time expense. They become a recurring operational burden. 2016, the state expanded labor standards, increasing minimum wage and mandating new overtime rules. The intended goal was to improve worker earnings. What actually happened was a rising baseline cost for every hour worked. For manufacturing, where labor is a major component of cost, the math shifted. Overtime became more expensive. Staffing became less flexible. 2017, California introduced stricter energy efficiency requirements for commercial buildings. The intended goal was to reduce consumption and emissions. What actually happened was higher upfront investment in retrofits and higher long-term costs for energy management. Factories that once ran on predictable utility bills now faced uncertainty. 2018, the state increased workplace safety inspections and compliance enforcement. The intended goal was to prevent accidents and improve conditions. What actually happened was more time spent on paperwork, more audits, and higher compliance staffing costs. For a company like Tesla, the cost was not just money. It was management attention. By 2019, the cost structure had shifted. Not dramatically overnight, but steadily. The state did not force companies to leave. It simply changed the incentives. Tesla and other manufacturers began to treat California as a high-cost zone, and that perception began shaping long-term strategy. 2020, California introduced stricter emissions rules for transportation and logistics. The intended goal was to reduce pollution from freight and improve air quality. What actually happened was a new layer of cost for moving parts and finished vehicles. Logistics became more expensive and timelines became less predictable. For Tesla, which relies on tight supply chains and rapid production cycles, this added friction. 2021, the state expanded union influence in manufacturing, encouraging stronger collective bargaining and more stringent labor conditions. The intended goal was to protect workers and strengthen job security. What actually happened was increased labor costs and reduced flexibility for staffing adjustments during production shifts. Tesla's internal calculations began to treat labor as less adjustable and more fixed. 2022, utility rates in California rose, driven by grid upgrades and wildfire risk mitigation. The intended goal was to stabilize the grid and reduce the frequency of outages. What actually happened was higher electricity costs for large industrial users and increased uncertainty about future rates. For an electric vehicle manufacturer, energy is not just a cost. It is a core input. 2023, California strengthened rules on supply chain reporting, requiring more detailed disclosures on sourcing and environmental impact. The intended goal was transparency and accountability. What actually happened was higher administrative costs and slower supplier onboarding. The state became more demanding, and the penalty for non-compliance became more severe. By the end of 2023, Tesla's internal strategy began shifting. The company still wanted to operate in California, but the state's incentives were now pushing expansion elsewhere. The decision was not sudden. It was a series of adjustments, each one small, that collectively changed the calculus. 2024, California's insurance market tightened, driven by wildfire risk and catastrophic losses. The intended goal was risk management and long-term stability. What actually happened was a sharp rise in premiums for industrial facilities. Factories became harder to insure, and insurance costs became a major line item on budgets. For Tesla, this was not a minor increase. It was a new fixed cost that could not be easily offset by productivity gains. 2024, the state also increased enforcement of building codes and safety standards, especially in industrial zones. The intended goal was to prevent accidents and protect communities. What actually happened was more frequent inspections and more stringent penalties for violations. Even minor issues could trigger expensive repairs and delays. Manufacturing does not tolerate delays. Delays mean lost production, and lost production means lost revenue. 2024, California's grid instability became more visible, with rolling blackouts and emergency shutdowns during peak demand. The intended goal was to prevent system overload and protect public safety. What actually happened was an increased risk of production interruptions. For an EV factory, downtime is expensive. It disrupts the flow of parts, assembly lines, and deliveries. Late 2024, Tesla's leadership began a final review of California operations. The state's policies were not a single issue. They were a bundle of rising costs, risks, and uncertainty. The last few decisions did not cause the closure. They made it unavoidable. Tesla did not announce the closure because it wanted to. It announced it because the incentives left no alternative. The decision was the end result of a chain, not a sudden shock. Auto manufacturing is not a single process. It is a chain of linked operations, from stamping metal to battery assembly, to painting, to final inspection. Each step depends on the previous one, and the entire system runs on tight timing. If one link slows, the whole line slows. That is why manufacturing margins are thin. A small delay or cost increase can wipe out profit. The real cost in a factory is not the raw materials. It is fixed costs: rent, insurance, energy, and staffing. Those costs do not disappear when production slows. They remain. So the factory must produce enough volume to cover them. If the cost of fixed inputs rises, the required volume rises too. That is why companies push for higher output, and why they resist any increase in fixed costs. Electric vehicle makers are especially sensitive because energy is not a small expense. Battery production and assembly require high power consumption. If electricity rates rise, the cost per vehicle rises. If grid reliability drops, downtime rises. Downtime means fewer cars, but fixed costs stay the same. Labor is also a major factor. EV factories are more automated than traditional plants, but they still require skilled labor. When labor costs rise, automation becomes more attractive. But automation is expensive and it takes time. Small plants cannot afford that transition. They collapse first. Translation: when the state increases energy, labor, and compliance costs, the math changes. The factory still needs to cover fixed costs. If volume cannot increase enough to cover them, the factory becomes unsustainable. That is the mechanism behind the closure. Tesla's California factory employs around 10,000 workers. That is not a single number. It is a workforce, a community, and a payroll that supports families and local businesses. When the factory closes, those jobs do not simply move. They disappear or relocate, and the people affected must find new work in a market that may not have the same capacity. So what? The first impact is immediate unemployment, and the second is reduced local spending. The factory produces roughly 400,000 vehicles per year at peak capacity. That volume is not just a production statistic. It represents parts orders, shipping contracts, and supplier relationships. When production drops, the entire supply chain feels it. So what? The closure does not just stop cars. It stops the demand that keeps dozens of smaller companies in business. California collects an estimated billions in tax revenue from Tesla operations, including sales, property, and payroll taxes. That revenue funds local services, schools, and infrastructure. When it disappears, cities face a gap they did not plan for. So what? Municipal budgets shrink, and services may be cut, or taxes raised. The cost of compliance and energy increases has been measured in the hundreds of millions for large industrial operations. That is the hidden number behind the headlines. So what? It means the state's policy package is not just a regulation. It is a financial pressure that shifts where manufacturing is profitable. These numbers are not isolated. They are connected, and they reveal the scale of the chain reaction. Domino 1, the workers and suppliers. When Tesla shuts down the factory, the first group affected is the workforce. 10,000 employees lose their jobs or are forced to relocate. That is not just a statistic. It is a sudden loss of income for households that rely on stable paychecks. At the same time, suppliers lose orders. Battery parts, metal stamping, electronics, and logistics vendors all feel the drop in demand. This domino hits the people who built the system, the ones who did not write the rules. Domino 2, local communities and small businesses. The factory's payroll supported local retail, restaurants, and service providers. When paychecks disappear, local spending shrinks. Small businesses that depended on Tesla workers as customers see fewer sales. Commercial landlords face empty leases. City budgets face reduced tax revenue. Public services, from schools to road maintenance, now face a new shortfall. The impact moves from the factory to the entire community, and the effect is amplified by the loss of secondary income. Domino 3, the state economy and national supply chain. Tesla is not just a company, it is a node in a national and global supply chain. When one major factory closes, production shifts to other states or countries. That shift changes shipping routes, logistics hubs, and supplier networks. California loses not only jobs, but also its position in the manufacturing map. Other states gain. The consequence expands beyond the state border, altering where the next generation of manufacturing will happen. Each domino affects a different group, and the scope grows. This is how a policy decision becomes a national economic shift. Meet Daniel, a line supervisor at the Tesla factory in Fremont. He has worked there for 6 years. He oversees a team that assembles battery packs. He knows the production targets, the schedules, and the exact cost of downtime. His job is not just technical, it is logistical. When the closure announcement arrived, he did not react with anger or surprise. He reacted with a quiet understanding that the decision was not about performance. It was about incentives. Daniel's team now faces layoffs, and the skills they built in California may be forced to move elsewhere. Then there is Amina, a local supplier manager, who runs a small parts company in the same county. Her business supplied specialized components to Tesla for years. She hired extra staff to meet demand. She invested in new equipment based on long-term contracts. Her company did not fail because of product quality or management. It failed because the demand was pulled out from under it. The closure is not just a corporate decision for her. It is a loss of contracts and a loss of stability for her employees. Neither Daniel nor Amina are part of the policy debate. They are part of the outcome. Their stories show the human cost of the chain reaction. They also show something else, a detail that mainstream coverage often misses. This is not a story about a single factory. It is a story about how policy changes ripple through the economy, touching people who never asked to be part of the experiment. These are the consequences of incentives. And the consequences are still unfolding. The irony is that the state's policies were meant to protect workers, strengthen communities, and reduce emissions. The outcome is a major manufacturer leaving, jobs disappearing, and supply chains shifting away. The goal was stability. The result is instability. The goal was sustainability. The result is relocation. The contradiction is not dramatic. It is mathematical. When the cost of operating becomes too high, companies do not stay because of loyalty or symbolism. They stay because the numbers allow them to. The policy package succeeded in its stated goals. Wages rose. Safety standards improved. Emissions rules tightened. But the unintended outcome is a new incentive structure that pushes manufacturing out of the state. That is the core irony. The state aimed to protect its workforce, but it created a system that makes large-scale employment harder to maintain. The policy did not fail in intent. It failed in long-term design. This is not isolated to Tesla. The same model is being repeated in other industries, from logistics to tech manufacturing. Other states are watching. They see a pattern. When one state raises costs, another state lowers them. Companies migrate. Supply chains adjust. The map of American manufacturing changes. If California does not align incentives with outcomes, the next exit will not be a single factory. It will be an entire sector. And the precedent has already been set. The chain reaction is not finished. It is only getting louder. Tesla announced a massive factory closure in California. It was not caused by falling demand, technology failure, or poor performance. It was caused by a changing cost structure driven by state policy, rising energy and insurance costs, and tighter compliance rules. Those changes shifted the incentives for large-scale manufacturing. Tesla responded rationally, as any company would, by moving production to a more predictable cost environment. The first domino hit workers and suppliers. The second domino hit local communities and small businesses. The third domino hit the state economy and the national supply chain. The irony is that policies meant to protect workers and the environment created a system that pushes manufacturing out. The result is fewer jobs, less local tax revenue, and a weakened manufacturing base. The chain reaction is not over. Other industries are watching and adjusting. The map of American manufacturing is shifting, and the consequences are still unfolding. So here is the accountability question, and it is a simple one. If the goal was stability, Why was the long-term economic impact not planned for? Leave your answer in the comments. If you want more investigations like this, subscribe. The story is not ending. It is moving. And the next domino may already be falling.